Case 1. Marie No. Crimes committed between 1949 and 1968. Court of Common Pleas, Philadelphia County. There are names that become permanently woven into the fabric of a city's darkest history. Names that investigators whisper decades later. Names that reshape how an entire community understands the concept of danger. In the Kensington neighborhood of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, one such name belonged to a woman who, for nearly 20 years, was regarded by her neighbors as a grieving mother, a woman who had suffered more loss than any one person should ever be asked to bear. She attended church. She spoke softly. She welcomed condolence visits into her home. And for nearly 20 years, the city of Philadelphia mourned alongside her. Her name was Marie No. And the truth, when it finally came, did not arrive like a sudden storm. It arrived slowly, methodically, carried on the shoulders of a single investigative journalist whose refusal to accept the official narrative changed everything. Marie No was born on August 17, 1927, in the city of Philadelphia. She grew up in working-class surroundings, eventually settling into the Kensington neighborhood with her husband, Arthur No. By all outward appearances, the Noes were an unremarkable couple, quiet, private, embedded in the rhythms of neighborhood life. But beginning in 1949, something began to happen inside the walls of their home that would not be fully understood for another 50 years. Over the course of nearly 2 decades, Marie No gave birth to 10 children. 8 of those children did not survive infancy. The losses were documented, mourned, and explained away, attributed in official records to sudden infant death syndrome, a diagnosis that, during the 1950s and 1960s, carried enormous medical uncertainty. Physicians of that era had limited tools to distinguish natural infant death from something far more deliberate. Marie No was never questioned with suspicion. She was consoled. The first child, Richard Allen No, arrived in 1949 and did not survive. The second child, Elizabeth Mary, followed and also did not survive. Then came Jacqueline, who lived only 1 day. Then Mary Lee, then Constance, then Joseph, then Mary, then Kathy. Each one gone before reaching the age of 14 months. Each death recorded, each one buried. Arthur No, by all accounts, accepted the losses with quiet resignation. The community accepted them as tragedy. 2 of the 10 children survived. 1 was placed for adoption. The other, a daughter, lived into adulthood. For 2 decades, Marie No remained above suspicion. Philadelphia's medical and legal community never formally challenged the pattern. The sheer volume of loss was explained away by theories of genetic vulnerability, of tragic family medical history, of circumstances that science at the time could not fully account for. No one asked the harder question. No one looked closely enough. That changed in 1998. Stephen Fried, an investigative journalist writing for Philadelphia Magazine, began examining the No case not as a cold case reopening, but as a historical medical investigation. His work raised what prosecutors and medical examiners had never publicly raised, that the consistent pattern of infant death within a single household, across nearly 2 decades, was statistically and medically incompatible with natural causes. The piece ignited a response from the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. Investigators reopened the case. Forensic specialists and child death experts were consulted. What they found, in the accumulated records, the timelines, and the circumstances surrounding each infant's passing, led them to a conclusion that changed the case entirely. Marie No was confronted, and in a development that stunned everyone who had followed the story, she confessed. In June of 1999, Marie No appeared before the Court of Common Pleas in Philadelphia County and pleaded guilty to 8 counts of second-degree murder. She was 81 years old. She told investigators, in statements that were later made part of the court record, that she had deliberately caused the death of each child, sometimes in moments she described as driven by impulse, sometimes in circumstances she claimed she could not fully explain. Forensic psychologists who evaluated her described complex psychological findings, including elements consistent with what is now understood as Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a condition in which a caregiver causes or fabricates illness in a dependent person to gain attention or sympathy. The sentencing that followed reflected both the gravity of the crimes and the complications of prosecuting an 81-year-old woman for acts committed across 5 decades. Judge Frank O'Brien sentenced Marie No to 20 years of probation and ordered mandatory psychiatric treatment and supervision. She would serve no prison time. The sentence ignited controversy across Philadelphia and across the country. Victim advocates argued that the victims, 8 infants, deserved more. Legal analysts pointed to the age of the defendant, the age of the evidence, and the complexity of the psychiatric findings as factors the court had weighed carefully. Marie No died on November 5, 2014, at the age of 86, having served her full probation term. She never offered a public explanation that fully satisfied the families of her victims or the investigators who had spent years rebuilding the case. The 8 children she lost were never given the chance to grow up, to speak, to be known by the world as anything other than names on a list of victims. What the Marie No case ultimately revealed was not just the failure of one woman, but the failure of a system, a medical and legal infrastructure that, for nearly 2 decades, lacked both the tools and the institutional will to ask the right questions about what was happening inside a home in Kensington. Her case became a landmark reference in child death investigations, reshaping how medical examiners, pediatric specialists, and law enforcement approach unexplained infant mortality to this day. In Philadelphia, the name Marie No is now taught in forensic medicine courses and cited in child protection training. The 8 children who were taken from the world before they had the chance to live were not forgotten. Their existence, and the failure to protect them, became the foundation of reforms that have since saved other lives. If you or someone you know has concerns about child welfare or the safety of a child in your community, the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, at 1-800-422-4453. No child should be left without a voice. Justice, even when it arrives late, still matters. For the 8 children of Kensington who never got the chance to tell their own stories, the pursuit of accountability, however imperfect, was the only justice the world could offer. If this case moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every subscription helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Case 2, Lisa Snyder, September 23, 2019, Court of Common Pleas, Berks County. There are moments in an investigation when a story that appears to be one thing reveals itself to be something else entirely. In Albany Township, Berks County, Pennsylvania, emergency responders arrived on September 23, 2019, to what was initially reported as a tragic household emergency involving 2 young children. What they encountered set in motion an investigation that would ultimately expose one of the most disturbing cases in the history of the region. Lisa Snyder was 36 years old at the time. She lived in a rural home in Albany Township with her husband and her 2 children, a son named Connor, who was 8 years old, and a daughter named Brinley, who was 4. From the outside, the family appeared unremarkable. But on that September morning, emergency services received a call that would change everything. Investigators arriving at the scene discovered that both Connor and Brinley had suffered severe harm inside the family's basement. The children did not survive. Lisa Snyder told responding officers a story that shifted the focus of suspicion away from herself and toward her own son. She claimed that Connor had been experiencing profound distress related to bullying at school and suggested that he had been responsible for what had happened. It was a claim that, if accepted, would have closed the case quickly and quietly. But investigators did not accept it quickly. They did not accept it at all. The physical evidence at the scene was inconsistent with the account Lisa Snyder provided. Forensic specialists and child death investigators examined every detail of the scene and the condition of both children. What they reconstructed was a sequence of events that pointed not toward a child in crisis, but toward the children's own mother. The case was reclassified as a homicide investigation. Lisa Snyder was taken into custody. In the weeks and months that followed, investigators built a case that drew on physical evidence, digital forensic analysis, and behavioral patterns that prosecutors argued demonstrated not an act of impulse, but a deliberate course of action. Court documents filed in the case described a series of internet searches that investigators attributed to Lisa Snyder's devices in the period preceding September 23, searches that, according to prosecutors, demonstrated prior planning and awareness. The digital trail became one of the most significant elements of the prosecution's case. The community of Albany Township, a small and tightly connected rural area of Berks County, absorbed the news with the kind of quiet devastation that small communities often carry alone. Connor had been a student at a local elementary school. Brinley had been a 4-year-old who, by every account from those who knew her, had been a bright and affectionate child. Their loss reverberated through the township, through the school, and through the broader Berks County community in ways that words struggle to fully capture. Lisa Snyder's trial proceeded through the Berks County court system over the course of several years, delayed in part by the complexities of the evidence and the legal proceedings surrounding the case. Throughout the process, she maintained postures of denial in her public statements. Her defense team challenged elements of the prosecution's evidence. But the weight of the case that prosecutors had assembled, physical, digital, and circumstantial, ultimately proved insurmountable. On October 17, 2024, Lisa Snyder was sentenced by the Court of Common Pleas in Berks County to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. She will not leave prison. The judge presiding over the sentencing addressed the court with language that reflected the depth of what had been proven, that a mother, the person those 2 children trusted above all others in the world, had made a deliberate choice to end their lives and then had attempted to redirect blame onto her own 8-year-old son. The sentencing statement from the court made clear that Connor and Brinley Snyder deserved to be remembered not merely as victims of a crime, but as children. Children who had names and personalities and futures that were taken from them. Child safety advocates in Pennsylvania pointed to the Snyder case as a reminder of how critical it is for communities, schools, and neighbors to remain engaged with the welfare of children around them. Connor and Brinley are gone, but their names remain. The accountability that the justice system delivered on October 17, 2024 ensured that the truth of what happened in Albany Township would not be buried alongside them. If you are concerned about the safety of a child in your community, please reach out to the Pennsylvania Childline Reporting Hotline at 1-800-9-320-313. Children cannot always speak for themselves. We must be willing to speak for them. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that matter. Case 3, Shana Decree, between February 23 and February 25, 2019, Court of Common Pleas, Bucks County. There are crimes so incomprehensible in their scale that investigators, upon arriving at the scene, struggle to process what they are seeing. In Morrisville, Bucks County, Pennsylvania, what law enforcement discovered inside a single apartment in late February of 2019 tested the limits of that comprehension. 5 people were gone. 3 of them were children. And at the center of what investigators would piece together in the days and weeks that followed were 2 women, a mother and her daughter, whose actions inside that apartment remain among the most devastating in the recorded history of Bucks County. Shana Decree was 50 years old at the time. She lived in an apartment in Morrisville with her daughter Dominique Decree, who was 23, and several other family members including children. The family had a documented history of struggle, financial instability, mental health challenges, and the accumulated weight of circumstances that had made life inside that apartment increasingly difficult. But nothing in the documented history of the household prepared investigators for what they found on February 25, 2019. When officers entered the apartment following a welfare check request, they discovered the bodies of 5 people. Shana Decree's daughter, Not Decree, who was 25, Not's children, a 9-year-old and a 2-year-old, and 2 additional family members. The scene was described in court documents as representing evidence of severe harm to multiple individuals. Investigators determined that the events had unfolded over a period spanning approximately 2 days, between February 23 and February 25. Shana Decree and her daughter Dominique were taken into custody. Both were alive. Both were present in the apartment when officers arrived. The investigation that followed was conducted by the Bucks County District Attorney's Office and involved extensive forensic examination of the apartment, review of the relationships between the individuals involved, and evaluation of both defendants' mental states. Prosecutors built a case that established both Shana and Dominique Decree as active participants in what had occurred over those 2 days. The nature of the crimes, the number of victims, the vulnerability of the children among them, the duration over which the events unfolded, placed the case in a category that investigators and prosecutors alike described as unprecedented for Bucks County. Mental health evaluations played a significant role in the legal proceedings. Both Shana and Dominique Decree were assessed by forensic psychiatric experts. The evaluations contributed to the legal framework under which both women ultimately resolved their cases. In September of 2020, both Shana Decree and Dominique Decree entered pleas of guilty, but mentally ill, a legal designation in Pennsylvania that acknowledges the presence of serious mental illness, while simultaneously affirming criminal responsibility for the actions committed. Judge Diane Gibbons of the Court of Common Pleas in Bucks County sentenced both women to 5 consecutive life terms in prison. They will not be released. The sentencing addressed the totality of what had occurred, the loss of 5 lives, including 3 children who had had no capacity to protect themselves, no ability to escape, and no one in that apartment who chose to protect them. The community of Morrisville absorbed the case with a grief that did not dissipate quickly. Schools that had known some of the victims, neighbors who had lived beside the family, community organizations that had intersected with some of the individuals involved. All of them grappled with the question that communities always ask after a tragedy of this scale: what could have been done differently? What intervention, what resource, what moment of connection might have altered the course of what happened inside that apartment? The Bucks County District Attorney's Office and local child welfare advocates used the case in the years that followed as a focal point for conversations about the intersection of mental health resources, child welfare monitoring, and community support systems for families in crisis. The 5 people who lost their lives in that Morrisville apartment in February of 2019 deserved to grow old. The 3 children among them deserved futures that were never given to them. The sentences handed down in September of 2020 ensured that both women responsible for what happened in that apartment would spend the remainder of their lives in Pennsylvania State Prison. That is the accountability the legal system provided, the memory of the victims, and the responsibility all communities carry to protect their most vulnerable members is the accountability the rest of us must carry forward. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. We tell these stories so they are never forgotten. Case 4, Damyrra Jones, October 14, 2019, Philadelphia County. The Tacony neighborhood of Philadelphia is a residential community in the far northeast section of the city, a neighborhood of row homes and established families, the kind of place where people know their neighbors and children play on familiar streets. It is the kind of neighborhood that does not expect to become the location of a headline that will travel far beyond its borders. But on October 14, 2019, what happened inside one Tacony home altered that community permanently. Damyrra Jones was a 36-year-old Philadelphia resident living in the Tacony section with her husband and 2 daughters, a 4-year-old and an infant who had not yet reached her first birthday. By every account available to investigators who would later reconstruct the events of that October morning, the family had been experiencing serious domestic difficulties. The circumstances inside that household, the pressures, the conflicts, the state of the relationships within it, were matters that law enforcement and prosecutors would examine carefully in the months that followed. On the morning of October 14, 2019, Philadelphia police were called to the family's home. What they discovered when they entered required an immediate homicide investigation. Damyrra Jones's husband and both of her daughters, the 4-year-old and the 10-month-old infant, had all sustained gunshot wounds. None of them survived. Damyrra Jones herself had also sustained a self-inflicted gunshot wound. She was transported to a hospital, where she received treatment and survived. The Philadelphia Police Department's homicide unit took over the investigation. Investigators processed the scene, interviewed individuals with knowledge of the family's circumstances, and built an evidentiary record that prosecutors would subsequently use in charging decisions. The physical evidence at the scene, combined with the investigative findings that followed, led the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office to charge Damyrra Jones with 3 counts of criminal homicide, 1 count for each of the 3 people who lost their lives inside that Tacony home. The case drew significant attention within Philadelphia's victim advocacy community. The loss of 2 children, one of whom was an infant, alongside their father in a single incident represented a level of tragedy that reverberated through the Tacony neighborhood and through organizations across the city that work with families in crisis. Child welfare advocates, Domestic violence awareness organizations and community leaders all responded to the case with a shared recognition that the circumstances that preceded October 14th had been building in ways that the community around the family had not been positioned to intercept. Damyrra Jones remained in the custody of the Philadelphia court system following her arrest. Her case entered the legal proceedings that accompany charges of this gravity, preliminary hearings, evidentiary reviews, and the formal processes of the Court of Common Pleas in Philadelphia County. The case has proceeded through the system with the complexity that serious homicide prosecutions in Philadelphia typically involve. The two daughters who were taken from the world on that October morning, a 4-year-old and a child who had barely begun to experience the world, represent a loss that no legal proceeding can fully account for. Children at those ages are entirely dependent on the adults around them for safety, for protection, for the most basic guarantee that each day will bring them safely to the next. On October 14, 2019, that guarantee was broken for them in the most irreversible way possible. The Tacony community, neighbors, and the broader Philadelphia network of victim support organizations have carried the memory of this case forward as a reminder of why community awareness, crisis intervention resources, and accessible support systems for families under severe pressure are not optional features of a just society. They are necessities. The Philadelphia Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24 hours a day for anyone in the city who is in a dangerous situation or who knows someone who may be. 1-800-799-7233. Every child in Philadelphia deserves to be safe. Every family in crisis deserves access to help before a tragedy becomes irreversible. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. These children deserve to be remembered. Case 5, Chanthy Mao, August 31, 2011. Court of Common Pleas, Philadelphia County. The Point Breeze neighborhood of South Philadelphia is one of the city's most historically layered communities, a neighborhood that has seen generations of immigrant families build lives within its boundaries, raise children on its streets, and contribute to the fabric of a city that has always been shaped by the stories of those who came from somewhere else seeking something better. In 2011, a family in Point Breeze became the center of an investigation that drew the attention of the entire city and forced a difficult conversation about the intersection of mental health, family crisis, and the protection of children. Chanthy Mao was a resident of South Philadelphia living in the Point Breeze neighborhood with her 2 children, a daughter who was 12 years old and a son who was 8. The Mao family was known in their immediate community. The children attended local schools. Life inside the household had, by the accounts that emerged in subsequent legal proceedings, been marked by significant and documented difficulty in the period leading up to August 31, 2011. On that late August night, Philadelphia police responded to the family's home and discovered that both children had been severely harmed. Investigators determined that both the 12-year-old daughter and the 8-year-old son had sustained multiple stab wounds. Both children survived the physical injuries sustained that night, a fact that became central to the legal proceedings that followed and that represented, in the context of what investigators discovered at the scene, an outcome that could easily have been different. Chanthy Mao was taken into custody. Philadelphia's homicide unit and prosecutors from the district attorney's office began building a case against her. The investigation involved extensive review of Mao's documented mental health history, the circumstances of the household in the period leading up to August 31st, and the physical evidence recovered from the scene. The mental health component of the case became one of the most significant factors in the legal proceedings. Forensic psychiatric evaluations were conducted. The findings contributed to the framework within which prosecutors and defense counsel ultimately resolved the case. The complexity of what had occurred, the severity of the harm inflicted on the children, balanced against the documented mental health circumstances of the defendant, produced a legal resolution that reflected that complexity. In November of 2012, Chanthy Mao appeared before the Court of Common Pleas in Philadelphia County and entered a guilty plea to 2 counts of third-degree murder, a charge that, in Pennsylvania, carries significant sentencing weight while accounting for circumstances that distinguish the crime from first-degree intentional conduct in specific legal ways. Judge Rayford Means sentenced Chanthy Mao to 30 to 60 years in state prison. She will be in her 80s before she is eligible for consideration of release under that sentence. The two children who survived the events of August 31st, 2011 faced a recovery, physical and otherwise, that would extend far beyond the night itself. Child trauma specialists and victim advocates working with families in similar circumstances consistently note that children who experience severe harm within their own homes carry the weight of that experience in ways that require sustained, professional, compassionate support. The Philadelphia Department of Human Services and organizations across the city that work with child victims of trauma provide that kind of support, and their work matters enormously. The Chanthy Mao case became, in the years following the sentencing, a reference point in conversations about how Philadelphia's mental health system, child welfare infrastructure, and community support networks intersect, and where the gaps between those systems can allow a family crisis to escalate beyond the point of intervention. Mental health challenges, when left unsupported, when untreated, when compounded by the accumulated pressures of economic and social difficulty, can produce circumstances that destroy families. That understanding does not reduce accountability. It is not a justification. It is a recognition that prevention requires investment in mental health services, in crisis intervention, in community support that reaches families before they reach the edge. The sentence handed down in November of 2012 reflected the gravity of what Chanthy Mao did in that South Philadelphia home. The children who survived deserve every resource, every support, and every measure of healing that the city and its institutions can provide. Their survival, and the accountability that followed, are both part of a story that Philadelphia's child welfare community has not forgotten. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. If this story moved you, share it. These stories need to be told. Case 6, Trinh Nguyen, May 2, 2022, Court of Common Pleas, Bucks County. The community of Upper Makefield Township in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, is a quiet and affluent residential area, the kind of place where large homes sit on wooded lots, where the pace of life feels removed from the noise of the cities to the south and west, and where a sense of established security tends to define the texture of daily existence. It is a place where the kind of case that emerged in May of 2022 was not anticipated. But the truth that investigators uncovered in the aftermath of May 2nd did not care about expectations. It cared only about evidence. Trinh Nguyen was 42 years old when Philadelphia area law enforcement arrived at a home in Upper Makefield Township on May 2, 2022. Inside that home, investigators made a discovery that transformed a call for assistance into a major homicide investigation. Nguyen's two sons, a 9-year-old and a 13-year-old, had both been shot while they were asleep in their beds. Neither survived. The investigation that followed moved quickly. Bucks County detectives and prosecutors began assembling the evidentiary record that would define the prosecution's case. A neighbor had been targeted as well. Nguyen was alleged to have attempted to shoot a neighbor in the immediate aftermath of what occurred inside the home. The neighbor survived. The attempt to harm someone outside the household added a dimension to the investigation that broadened its scope and raised additional questions about the defendant's state of mind and intentions on that May morning. The circumstances that prosecutors alleged drove the events of May 2nd were rooted in the severe financial and legal pressures the family was experiencing at the time. Court documents filed in the case indicated that the household had been facing eviction proceedings, a legal and financial crisis that, prosecutors argued, had combined with other circumstances to produce a state of desperation that Trinh Nguyen had chosen to resolve through an act of irreversible violence against her own children. The legal proceedings in Bucks County moved through the court system over the course of approximately 18 months. The weight of the physical evidence, including the forensic findings from the scene, the ballistic evidence, the circumstances of the neighbor's encounter, and the full evidentiary record assembled by investigators, ultimately produced a resolution in which Trinh Nguyen entered a guilty plea before the Court of Common Pleas in Bucks County. In December of 2023, Judge Wallace Bateman sentenced Trinh Nguyen to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. She will not leave prison. The sentencing addressed the totality of what had occurred, the deliberate taking of 2 children's lives while they were in the most vulnerable state possible, asleep in their own beds, in a home that should have been the safest place in their world. The 9-year-old and the 13-year-old who lost their lives on May 2, 2022, had names, personalities, friendships, and futures. They were students. They had friends. They were children in every sense of the word. The Upper Makefield Township community that knew them grieved. Their schools grieved. The broader Bucks County community, upon learning of what had occurred, responded with the kind of collective sorrow that attaches itself to cases involving children and does not let go easily. Child welfare and community mental health advocates in Bucks County and across the greater Philadelphia region cited the Nguyen case in the years following the sentencing as a stark illustration of the danger that can emerge when families in severe financial and psychological crisis have no effective pathway to intervention. The pressure of eviction, of financial collapse, of the sense that there is no way forward. These are circumstances that destroy families in ways that are not always visible from the outside. Community organizations, legal aid services, and mental health crisis resources exist precisely because those circumstances require a response before they become irreversible. The accountability delivered by the Bucks County court system in December of 2023 was clear and absolute. 2 consecutive life terms. No parole. No possibility of return to the world from which 2 children were taken while they slept. Their memory deserves more than silence. Their story deserves to be told with the care and gravity that every child's story deserves. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every case we cover is a story that demands to be remembered. Case 7. Ruth DiRienzo-Whitehead. April 10, 2023. Court of Common Pleas, Montgomery County. Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, sits to the northwest of Philadelphia, a county of established suburban communities, respected school districts, and the kind of quiet residential normalcy that defines much of the greater Philadelphia metropolitan region. Horsham Township, within Montgomery County, is precisely that kind of community. It was in Horsham that, on the morning of April 10, 2023, something happened inside a private home that would send investigators into one of the most emotionally challenging cases the county's homicide unit had encountered in years. Ruth DiRienzo-Whitehead was 52 years old at the time. She lived in Horsham with her son, an 11-year-old boy who attended a local school and was, by the accounts of those who knew him, a typical child navigating the normal landscape of early adolescence. What happened to him in the early hours of April 10th was not discovered immediately. It was discovered when the child did not appear where he was expected, and when the adults responsible for checking on him found what investigators would later describe in court documents as a scene requiring immediate homicide investigation. The 11-year-old had been deprived of his life while he was asleep. Ruth DiRienzo-Whitehead was taken into custody by Horsham Township Police and investigators from the Montgomery County Detective Bureau. The investigation that followed was thorough and precise. Forensic specialists examined the scene. The circumstances of the household in the period leading up to April 10th were investigated. The history of the relationship between DiRienzo-Whitehead and her son, the family dynamics, the circumstances of their lives in the time preceding the crime, was examined carefully by investigators building the prosecution's case. Ruth DiRienzo-Whitehead was charged with first-degree murder. The classification reflected the deliberate and intentional nature of what investigators determined had occurred. Under Pennsylvania law, first-degree murder requires proof of specific intent, the deliberate, premeditated decision to take another person's life. The evidence assembled by Montgomery County prosecutors satisfied that standard. The legal proceedings moved through the Court of Common Pleas in Montgomery County across the subsequent months. In February of 2024, Ruth DiRienzo-Whitehead was found guilty of first-degree murder by a jury of her peers, a verdict that reflected the strength of the evidentiary case the prosecution had built and the jury's determination that the facts met the legal standard for the most serious classification of criminal homicide under Pennsylvania law. Judge Carolyn Carluccio sentenced Ruth DiRienzo-Whitehead to life in prison. Under Pennsylvania law, a conviction for first-degree murder carries a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment. There was no discretion in the sentencing. The verdict determined the outcome. Ruth DiRienzo-Whitehead will spend the remainder of her life in a Pennsylvania state correctional institution. The Horsham community responded to the verdict with the complex grief that communities carry when a case involves a child. The 11-year-old at the center of this case had been known by his school, known by neighbors, known by the community around the home, where he had grown up. His loss left a specific and irreplaceable absence. He had been in the middle of a life, a childhood, that should have continued for decades. It did not. Child welfare advocates and mental health specialists working across Montgomery County and the broader Philadelphia region cited this case, as they have cited others like it, as a reminder that the safety of children depends on far more than the absence of obvious danger signs. It depends on communities that are engaged, on systems that are connected, on adults who are willing to ask difficult questions when something feels wrong. An 11-year-old asleep in his own home should have been, by every measure of what a home should mean, absolutely safe. He was not, and the person responsible for his safety was the person who took it from him. The verdict of February 2024 and the life sentence that followed delivered the only form of accountability the legal system could offer. The memory of the child, his name, his life, what he was, and what he would have become, is the accountability that the rest of us must carry. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. We carry these stories forward so that the victims are never reduced to footnotes. Case 8, Sherrilynn Hawkins, son passed September 18, 2024, Court of Common Pleas, Montgomery County. There is a form of harm that does not announce itself with the sudden urgency of a crisis call. It is slower. It builds over time, day by day, in the accumulation of neglect, of needs unmet, of care withheld, of a person left without the basic necessities that sustain life. It is harm that can be hidden behind closed doors, behind the silence of a household that the outside world rarely sees clearly. And it is harm that, when investigators finally encounter it, leaves them confronting a reality that is among the most difficult to process in all of law enforcement work. In the Drescher section of Upper Dublin Township, Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, that slow and hidden form of harm came to light in September of 2024. Its victim was Tylen Hatchett, a 21-year-old man with significant disabilities who had been entirely dependent on the adults around him for every aspect of his care, his nutrition, his safety, and his survival. Tylen could not advocate for himself. He could not call for help. He was, in the most fundamental sense, at the mercy of those who were supposed to love him most. Sherrilynn Hawkins was Tylen's mother. She was the person legally, morally, and fundamentally responsible for his care. And what investigators determined had occurred inside the Upper Dublin Township home in the months and years preceding September 18, 2024, was a sustained failure of that responsibility, so profound that prosecutors characterized it as criminal conduct of the most serious order. When emergency responders and investigators arrived at the home, Tylen Hatchett was gone. The physical condition in which he was found, documented in forensic and medical records that became part of the court proceedings, reflected a level of deprivation that medical specialists described as extreme. The evidence indicated that Tylen had been denied adequate nutrition and basic care over an extended period, to a degree that his body had been unable to sustain. He had weighed, at the time of his passing, a fraction of what his frame and medical history indicated he should have weighed. The physical findings were, by every medical account introduced in the subsequent legal proceedings, consistent with the most severe manifestation of neglect-related harm. The Montgomery County District Attorney's Office opened a homicide investigation. Investigators from the County Detective Bureau worked with medical experts, social service records, and the full evidentiary record of the household to build the prosecution's case. What they assembled documented a pattern, a sustained, extended pattern of deprivation that had unfolded over time inside that Drescher home, while Tylen Hatchett had no capacity to seek help and no one from the outside world who intervened in time. Sherrilynn Hawkins was charged with third-degree murder, a charge that under Pennsylvania law addresses the knowing and reckless disregard for another person's life in circumstances that, while not requiring proof of premeditated intent, nonetheless reflect conduct so gravely irresponsible that the law treats it as criminal homicide. The charge reflected both the severity of what had occurred and the specific legal framework that prosecutors determined best fit the documented circumstances of Tylen's death. In October of 2025, Sherrilynn Hawkins appeared before the Court of Common Pleas in Montgomery County and entered a guilty plea to third-degree murder. The plea acknowledged her criminal responsibility for Tylen Hatchett's death. Judge Thomas Del Ricci sentenced her to 25 to 50 years in state prison, a sentence that, given her age at the time of sentencing, may effectively constitute a lifetime of incarceration. The Tylen Hatchett case drew responses from disability rights advocates, adult protective services professionals, and elder and dependent care organizations across Pennsylvania. The case illuminated, with devastating clarity, the profound vulnerability of adults with significant disabilities who are entirely dependent on family caregivers. The oversight systems, the mechanisms by which the outside world is supposed to remain aware of and connected to individuals in that situation, had not functioned in a way that protected Tylen. Adult protective services exists in Pennsylvania precisely because vulnerable adults, individuals whose disabilities prevent them from independently seeking help, require external systems of monitoring and support. When those systems fail to reach an individual in time, the consequences can be irreversible. Tylen Hatchett's case became a reference point in Pennsylvania policy conversations about adult protective services capacity, caseload management, and the mechanisms by which isolated vulnerable adults can be more effectively reached by the people whose job it is to protect them. Tylen Hatchett deserved to be cared for. He deserved nutrition. He deserved warmth. He deserved to be seen. The sentence handed down in October of 2025 ensured that the person responsible for his death will spend decades in prison. That is the accountability the court provided. The rest of us carry the obligation to ensure that the systems meant to protect people like Tylen are strong enough, funded enough, and connected enough to actually reach them. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Tylen's story deserves to be known. His name deserves to be remembered. Case 9, Jennifer Joseph, October 12, 2020, Court of Common Pleas, Philadelphia County. West Philadelphia is one of the city's most storied and complex neighborhoods. A community with deep historical roots, a rich cultural identity, and the full range of human experience that defines life in a major American urban center. It is a neighborhood of schools and churches, of community organizations and long-established families, of people who look out for one another in the way that dense urban communities often do. And it was in West Philadelphia that, on October 12, 2020, Philadelphia police responded to a call that would place the neighborhood at the center of one of the most heartbreaking investigations the city's homicide unit would handle that year. Jennifer Joseph was 34 years old at the time. She was the mother of a 5-year-old boy named Devin. Devin Joseph was, by every account that investigators gathered in the aftermath of October 12, a child in the fullest and most innocent sense of that word. 5 years old, living in West Philadelphia with his mother, embedded in the daily rhythms of early childhood. He trusted the person who was supposed to protect him most. When Philadelphia police and emergency responders arrived at the family's home on October 12, 2020, they found Devin Joseph. He had not survived. Investigators from the Philadelphia Homicide Unit began immediately building the evidentiary record of what had occurred. What they determined, based on the physical evidence at the scene, the forensic findings, and the full investigative record assembled in the weeks that followed, was that Devin had been subjected to severe harm by his own mother. The circumstances of what happened to Devin Joseph on that October night in West Philadelphia were among the most painful that Philadelphia's investigators and prosecutors encountered in 2020. Jennifer Joseph was taken into custody. She was charged with criminal homicide. The investigation was thorough. The evidence assembled by the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office was extensive. The legal proceedings that followed moved through the Court of Common Pleas in Philadelphia County over the course of approximately 20 months. In June of 2022, Jennifer Joseph entered a guilty plea to third-degree murder in connection with Devin's death. The plea acknowledged her criminal responsibility for what had happened to her 5-year-old son on October 12, 2020. The presiding judge sentenced Jennifer Joseph to 20 to 40 years in state prison. Under that sentence, she will serve a minimum of 20 years before becoming eligible for consideration of release, a period during which Devin Joseph will remain permanently 5 years old in the memory of everyone who knew him. The response to Devin Joseph's death from Philadelphia's community organizations, victim advocates, and child welfare professionals reflected the profound impact that cases involving very young children have on the people who work in those fields. A 5-year-old is at the absolute center of vulnerability, old enough to have a personality, a presence, a set of relationships and experiences that make him distinctly himself, but young enough to be entirely dependent on the adults around him for survival. Devin had a name. He had a face. He was known to people in his community. His loss was not an abstraction. Philadelphia's child welfare and domestic support organizations have, in the years since October 2020, continued the work of ensuring that families in crisis, families where children are at risk of harm, have access to intervention resources before a crisis becomes a catastrophe. The Department of Human Services in Philadelphia operates a 24-hour hotline for child welfare concerns, 215-683-600. Anyone with concerns about a child's safety in Philadelphia is encouraged to use it. No concern is too small. No call is unnecessary when a child's safety is at stake. Devin Joseph deserved to grow up. He deserved to reach 6 years old, and 10, and 20, and to become whatever person he was going to become. The 20 to 40-year sentence handed down in June of 2022 by the Court of Common Pleas in Philadelphia County ensures that the person who took that future from him will spend decades in a Pennsylvania correctional facility. It is the accountability the system provided. Devin's name, his full name, Devin Joseph, deserves to be spoken and remembered, not as a case number, not as a statistic, as a child who mattered, who was real, and whose absence from West Philadelphia is felt. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Devin's story deserves to be carried forward. Case 10, Cynthia Robinson, November 5, 2025, Court of Common Pleas, Delaware County. There are cases that arrive at the threshold of the justice system carrying the full weight of a community's grief and outrage. Cases where the facts, as investigators have assembled them, are so deeply troubling that the formal language of charging documents struggles to contain what those documents actually describe. In Chester, Delaware County, Pennsylvania, a case that entered the formal legal process in April of 2026 is carrying exactly that weight. The victim at its center was 20 months old. His name has not been released publicly in all reports, but his age, 20 months, is all that is needed to understand what is at stake in this case. Cynthia Robinson is the child's mother. Frank Walton Sr. is the child's father. Both are adults. Both have been charged by the Delaware County District Attorney's Office in connection with events that investigators have determined occurred on November 5, 2025, in the city of Chester, Delaware County. Chester is a small city located directly south of Philadelphia along the Delaware River, a community that has faced persistent economic and social challenges over decades, and that carries within its borders the full complexity of urban life in the post-industrial Pennsylvania corridor. According to the charging documents filed by the Delaware County District Attorney's Office, Cynthia Robinson is accused of inflicting severe physical harm on her 20-month-old son on November 5, 2025, in a manner that resulted in the child's death. The nature of the harm alleged, described in the charging documents as a physical attack on a toddler, was determined by investigators and forensic specialists to be inconsistent with any accidental or innocent explanation. The child did not survive. The role attributed to Frank Walton Sr. in the charging documents adds a dimension to this case that investigators and prosecutors have characterized as a deliberate effort to conceal what had occurred. According to the charges filed against Walton, he is accused of withholding medical care from the child following the injury, a decision that, if proven as alleged, extended the child's suffering and prevented any possibility of emergency medical intervention that might have altered the outcome. The accusation that a parent deliberately prevented medical assistance for an injured toddler in order to conceal what had happened is among the most serious of the charges the Delaware County system is called upon to adjudicate. In April of 2026, the Delaware County District Attorney's Office formally charged Cynthia Robinson with first-degree murder and related offenses. Frank Walton Sr. faces charges related to his alleged role in the events following the child's injury. Both are currently in custody. No trial date has been finalized in the public record as of the time this documentary was produced. The legal proceedings are ongoing. This case is being presented here in its investigative and charging context. The facts as they have been documented and formally alleged by the Delaware County legal system, because the accountability that the justice system is now called to deliver matters. A 20-month-old child is gone. A 20-month-old child who could not walk away from danger, could not call for help, could not protect himself in any way. A child who depended entirely on the two adults who were supposed to be his protectors. The Chester community has watched this case develop with the attention and grief that such a case demands. Community advocates, child welfare professionals, and law enforcement officials across Delaware County and the greater Philadelphia region have pointed to the case as a reminder of the critical importance of reporting suspected child abuse immediately, without hesitation, without second-guessing, without waiting for certainty that may never come when the only witness is too young to speak. In Pennsylvania, suspected child abuse can be reported to the Child Line Abuse Registry at 1-800-9-320-313. Reports can be made anonymously. The safety of a child is always worth the discomfort of making the call. Cynthia Robinson and Frank Walton Sr. now face the Delaware County justice system. The legal process will proceed. Evidence will be presented. The accountability that the legal system is designed to deliver will be sought by prosecutors on behalf of a 20-month-old child who can no longer speak for himself. The case is not closed. The proceedings are not complete. But the story of a toddler in Chester, Delaware County, whose life ended on November 5, 2025, is already fully told in the most important sense. A child was here. A child mattered. A child deserved to be safe. He was not. And the people who were supposed to keep him safe are now in custody, facing the full weight of the legal system's response. That response will continue. And Cold Case Hour will continue to follow it, as we follow every case where justice is still being sought and where the memory of a victim demands that we do not look away. This documentary has taken us through 10 cases, 10 stories of loss, of harm done to children and vulnerable people who deserve protection, and of a justice system that was called upon to respond. The cases span the city of Philadelphia and its surrounding counties, Berks, Bucks, Montgomery, Delaware, the full geography of a region that, like every region in this country, has confronted moments when the systems designed to protect its most vulnerable members were not enough. The children and individuals at the center of these 10 cases were real. They had names. They had ages. They had futures that were taken from them. The accountability that courts delivered, the sentences, the convictions, the charges now pending, represents what the legal system can do. What communities can do is something different and something more. Invest in prevention, support child welfare and mental health systems, report concerns without hesitation, and refuse to accept the idea that tragedies of this kind are inevitable. If you have concerns about a child's safety, please contact the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453, available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You may be the only person in a position to make the call that changes everything. Thank you for watching Cold Case Hour. If this documentary informed you, moved you, or reminded you of why this work matters, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every subscriber, every like, every comment tells the platform that this content matters and helps us continue bringing these stories to the audience that needs to hear them. We will be back with more. Stay with us.